The metal doors of the shuttle hissed open as Joe Miller took his first breath of filtered air on Galactic Academy Station. The recycled atmosphere tasted strange, but after 3 weeks in transit from Earth, any new sensation was welcome. He grabbed his single regulation duffel bag and stepped onto the gleaming floor of the arrival terminal. Human student Joe Miller, please proceed to processing station 4, announced a melodic voice from invisible speakers. Joe walked toward the indicated booth, trying not to stare at the variety of alien forms moving through the terminal. Some floated on cushions of air. Others slithered across specially moistened pathways, and a few bounded along on multiple limbs. He had studied the most common galactic species during his preparation courses, but seeing them in person was entirely different. At Station 4, a blue-skinned humanoid with 4 arms looked up from a holographic display. The alien's eyes, all 6 of them, widened momentarily before settling into what Joe hoped was a professional gaze. "Welcome to Galactic Academy of Sciences, Human Joe Miller," the processing officer said in carefully pronounced English. I am Administrative Officer Peltoon. Your species designation is..." The alien paused, checking the display again. "Class 12 Deathworld origin. Is this correct?" Joe nodded. "Yes, that's Earth's classification." 2 of Peltoon's hands twitched slightly. "You are our first Earth-human exchange student. The Academy has made special accommodations for your physical requirements." Joe tried to smile in a way that wouldn't show too many teeth. His orientation materials had warned that predator features could unsettle many galactic species. "I appreciate that. I've been told my room is reinforced?" "Yes." "Standard quarters would not withstand your density or strength potential," Peltoon said matter-of-factly. "You are housed in Dormitory Wing C, typically reserved for higher gravity species. Your roommate is Zixtal, a Florbian third-year botany specialist." The officer handed Joe a thin metallic rectangle that glowed with shifting symbols. "This is your access key and campus guide. It has been programmed with translation software for all Academy languages and contains your class schedule." Joe pocketed the device and thanked the officer. As he turned to leave, Peltoon added, "Human Joe Miller, a word of caution. Most students here have never encountered a Deathworlder before. They may react unpredictably to your presence." "I understand," Joe said. Earth had only joined the Galactic Alliance 3 years ago, and humans were still a rarity beyond their solar system. Following the glowing path projected by his guide device, Joe made his way through wide corridors designed to accommodate beings of vastly different sizes. He noticed how other students gave him a wide berth, conversations pausing as he passed. Some peered at him with obvious scientific curiosity, while others hastily moved away, their body language, even on completely alien forms, clearly showing fear. Joe heard whispered fragments as he passed. "Can endure radiation that would kill most species," and unevolved on a planet with regular natural disasters. And even, "I heard they drink poison for enjoyment." The guide led him to Dormitory Wing C, a section with noticeably thicker walls and reinforced flooring. The door to his assigned room slid open automatically, revealing a space divided into 2 distinct halves. The right side was filled with rich purple soil and bathed in reddish light from special growth lamps. The left contained furnishings that actually looked like they might support Joe's weight, a rarity in the galaxy where most beings were significantly lighter than humans. "Hello?" Joe called out. "Zixtal, I'm Joe Miller, your new roommate." A. Rustling came from the soil side of the room, and slowly, a plant-like being emerged. Zixtal resembled nothing so much as a walking fern with delicate frond limbs and a central stalk, topped with sensory buds that Joe assumed served as eyes. The Florbian trembled slightly, its fronds curling inward defensively. "Greetings, human." "Joe?" Zixtal's voice was like leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. "I was informed of your arrival. I have..." The plant being paused, visibly gathering courage. "I have prepared information about my species' needs to avoid any unfortunate incidents." Joe set his bag down carefully, conscious that even this ordinary movement was being watched with alarm. I'd appreciate that information, Zixtal. And please just call me Joe. I've also brought materials about human needs and limitations. The plant being seemed to relax slightly, unfurling a few fronds. You are smaller than I expected for a Deathworlder. Joe laughed softly. I'm actually quite average for a human. Zixtal's sensory buds flickered with light, an expression Joe couldn't interpret. The Academy sent preparatory materials. They said humans can break metal with their bare limbs and survive in temperatures that would kill most sentient life. That's technically true but extremely exaggerated, Joe said, sitting down on his bed, which creaked but held. We're really not as scary as the reports make us sound. Zixtal made a sound like wind through branches, possibly a skeptical laugh. The Environmental Science Department disagrees. They have been discussing your arrival for weeks. Joe unpacked his few belongings while attempting to make conversation with his nervous roommate. He learned that Florbians were photosynthetic beings from a gentle world with constant mild temperatures and no predators. Their society emphasized harmony and gradual growth, quite literally. Your classes begin tomorrow, Zixtal noted, gesturing to Joe's guide device. What is your specialization? Joe activated the device. Xenocultural studies with a focus on interspecies communication. I'm hoping to work for the diplomatic corps eventually. He scrolled through his schedule for the next day: basic xenobiology, introduction to galactic history, comparative communication systems, and introductory survival athletics. Joe read aloud, confused. Zixtal's entire form shuddered. Physical education. It is required for all students, though. Most species take different courses based on their physiological capabilities. And which course level am I in? Joe asked. You are the only Class 12 species currently enrolled, Zixtal replied. I believe they have made special arrangements. Joe continued scrolling through the details and found the instructor's note. Human student to be observed for baseline physical capabilities. Reinforced equipment will be provided. Safety protocols have been updated. He looked up to see Zixtal had retreated several feet away, nearly burying itself back in its soil bed. Is something wrong? Tomorrow is also when environmental science. Students observe physical education classes for their research. The Florbian said quietly. Half the academy will be watching your first gym class. Joe felt a knot form in his stomach. He had come to the academy to be a student, not a research subject. I'm sure it won't be that bad, he said, trying to convince himself as much as his roommate. That night, as the station's lights dimmed to simulate night cycle, Joe lay on his reinforced bed, listening to the gentle photosynthetic humming from Zixtal's side of the room. Outside their door, he occasionally heard the shuffle of feet and whispered conversations as curious students passed by, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Deathworlder. Tomorrow would be his first real test. Not of his strength or endurance, but of his ability to fit into a society that viewed his very existence as terrifying. As he drifted off to sleep, Joe wondered what exactly introductory survival athletics would entail for the only human on campus. Joe woke to a soft chiming sound from his guide device. The room's lighting was still dim, simulating pre-dawn conditions for Earth-normal circadian rhythms. He stretched carefully, mindful of the reinforced but still relatively fragile furniture. Across the room, Zixtal remained motionless in his soil bed, fronds spread wide to catch the first artificial rays that would soon flood his side of the room. Joe moved quietly through his morning routine. He had been warned that his normal human habits might disturb or alarm other species. The academy had provided him with a private washing cubicle at the end of the hallway, specially designed to handle the extreme water temperatures humans preferred. As Joe turned the shower dial, he heard a horrified gasp. He turned to see a gelatinous student with multiple eye stalks staring at the temperature display. Is that setting correct? The alien bubbled in accented standard galactic. That is nearly at boiling point for dihydrogen monoxide. Joe nodded. It's just hot water. Normal for humans. The gelatinous student rippled with what Joe interpreted as distress and quickly oozed away. Joe sighed. Day 1. And he was already the station's monster. When Joe returned to his room, Zixtal was awake, his fronds gently waving in a shaft of artificial sunlight. "Good morning," Joe said, packing his study materials. "Greetings. Did you regenerate adequately?" Zixtal asked, his voice cautious but less fearful than yesterday. "I slept well, thanks," Joe replied. "I'm heading to breakfast before class. Would you like to join me?" Zixtal's central stalk straightened in what Joe guessed was surprise. I absorb nutrients during light cycle, but I could accompany you to observe your fueling process." Joe smiled. "That would be nice." The Academy's Nutrition Center was a vast hall with different environmental sections catering to the diverse needs of its students. Joe followed signs to the carbon-based omnivore section. Zixtal hovered nervously at his side, attracting curious looks from other students. A Florbian voluntarily accompanying a Deathworlder was apparently unusual enough to merit attention. Joe selected food items that resembled Earth breakfast foods, synthetic protein, carbohydrate discs that looked like pancakes and a cup of what the label optimistically called coffee analog. He sat at an empty table, aware of the buffer zone of unoccupied seats that quickly formed around him. "Your consumption process is very efficient," Zixtal observed as Joe ate. "Most predator species require much longer to process their fuel." Joe nearly choked on his coffee. "I'm not a predator species." "Your forward-facing eyes, tearing dentition, and protein-heavy diet suggest otherwise," Zixtal replied matter-of-factly. Before Joe could defend humanity's omnivorous nature, a new voice interrupted. "You must be the Earth human." A tall, lean figure with iridescent scales and elegantly swept-back head crests stood beside their table. Unlike most students Joe had encountered, this one showed no fear, only a cold, assessing interest. "I'm Joe Miller," Joe offered, extending his hand before remembering this was often considered threatening. He quickly withdrew it. "Chinzar," the scaled being replied with a slight incline of his head. "Class 5 World Viridian System. I serve as student representative to the Academy Board." His multifaceted eyes flicked over Joe. "We rarely get Deathworlders here. The few that attempt our curriculum usually withdraw within a semester." There was something challenging in Chinzar's tone that made Joe straighten in his seat. "I plan to complete the full exchange year." "Ambitious," Chinzar said, his mouth forming what might have been a smile or a grimace. "I look forward to observing your progress, especially in practical courses. I believe we share introductory survival athletics." With a slight nod to both Joe and the visibly uncomfortable Zixtal, Chinzar moved away to join a group of similarly scaled students who were watching the exchange with interest. "What was that about?" Joe asked quietly. Zixtal's fronds trembled slightly. "Chinzar is from one of the highest gravity worlds represented at the Academy. His species prides themselves on their physical capabilities. Until now, they have dominated all athletic competitions." Joe groaned. "Great. Interspecies rivalry on day 1. His first 2 classes, Basic Xenobiology and Introduction to Galactic History, passed without major incidents." Joe noticed how other students left empty seats around him, and how professors occasionally used him as an example of extreme evolutionary adaptations. It was uncomfortable, but educational. He learned more about how the galaxy viewed Earth, a violently unstable planet with extreme temperature variations, dangerous wildlife, and unpredictable natural disasters. By lunchtime, Joe had been approached by 7 different science students asking to scan him or take samples for research projects. He politely declined them all. As he navigated to his next class, a voice called out from behind. "Hey, Earth boy, wait up." Joe turned to see a human woman hurrying toward him. She was short, with curly brown hair, and the biggest smile Joe had seen since leaving Earth. "Another human," Joe exclaimed in relief. "Lily Green," she said, offering her hand for a genuine human handshake. "Been here 1 semester already. The only other human until you showed up." "Joe Miller," he replied, gratefully taking her hand. "I didn't know there was another human student." "Exchange program from the Western Hemisphere," Lily explained as they walked together. "And before you ask," Yes, everyone's still completely terrified of me, but they're getting used to it. Saw you had gym class today and thought I'd warn you. Joe frowned. What should I expect? Coach Vraxthul is obsessed with Deathworlder physiology. When I showed up, he spent the first session just having me lift things while the other students watched from behind protective barriers. She laughed at the memory. The standard gravity here is about a third of Earth's, so be careful. Your first step might launch you into the ceiling. Thanks for the warning, Joe said. Any other advice? Lily's expression grew more serious. Watch out for Chinzar and his friends. They see humans as a threat to their status. And be careful in the gym. Everything is more fragile than it looks to us. I met Chinzar at breakfast, Joe admitted. He seemed competitive. His species is top of the physical hierarchy here, or was until humans showed up. We're not as fast or agile, but in raw strength. Lily shrugged. Let's just say Earth's gravity gives us certain advantages. Here's my stop. She pointed to a classroom door. Find me after your gym class. You'll need someone to talk to. Joe continued to his communications class, his mind now focused on the upcoming athletic session. As he entered the classroom, conversations stopped. Students shifted away, creating the now familiar empty zone around him. Just before the professor arrived, Joe noticed Chinzar and 3 friends enter and take seats directly behind him. He could feel their eyes on his back throughout the lecture, and occasionally caught whispered comments about testing the Deathworlder's limits and putting it in its place. As class ended, Joe checked his guide device. It was time for introductory survival athletics. His stomach tightened with apprehension as he followed the glowing path toward the gymnasium. Behind him, he heard Chinzar's group following at a careful distance, their anticipation almost palpable in the air. The academy gymnasium was unlike anything Joe had ever seen. The massive chamber stretched at least 100 meters in each direction, with walls that appeared to shift and change texture. Various apparatus and obstacles dotted the floor space, some recognizable as climbing structures or balance equipment, others completely alien in purpose. Most striking was the group of about 30 students gathered near the entrance, all wearing what appeared to be standardized exercise clothing, in various modified forms to accommodate their diverse physiologies. As Joe entered, every eye stalk, sensory frond, and visual receptor turned to stare at him. A collective step backward created an immediate clear zone around him. Ah, human Joe Miller has arrived, boomed a deep, enthusiastic voice. The source was a massive being who resembled a boulder with 6 thick limbs and a cluster of small eyes on what Joe guessed was its front. The creature wore what looked like a whistle on a chain around its middle. I am Coach Vraxthul, the rocky being announced, rolling closer to Joe with surprising speed. Primary physical education instructor. I have been most eager for your arrival. Joe noticed the coach showed none of the fear exhibited by the students. Instead, there was an almost unsettling excitement in his clustered eyes. Today's session will be basic obstacle navigation under standard academy gravity, Coach Vraxthul announced to the class. As we have a new Class 12 species student, we will first observe typical class exercises before introducing him to modified equipment. The coach gestured to a course laid out across the gym floor. It included climbing walls about 3 meters high, balance beams suspended over cushioned pits, weighted balls that needed to be pushed across marked lines, and a series of hurdles. Chinzar, demonstrate proper technique for our new student, the coach instructed. The scaled alien stepped forward, moving with fluid grace. Joe watched as Chinzar traversed the obstacles with impressive agility. He scaled the climbing wall using just his fingertips, balanced perfectly on the narrow beam, pushed a weighted ball that appeared quite heavy with focused effort, and cleared the hurdles with elegant leaps. The other students applauded as Chinzar finished the course in what must have been record time. He gave Joe a look that clearly communicated a challenge. Several other students attempted the course with varying success. Some, like a 6-limbed insectoid, excelled at the climbing portion but struggled with the weighted ball. Others showed different strengths and weaknesses, but all completed the course competently. Now, Coach Vraxthul said, his voice vibrating, with barely contained excitement, Human Joe Miller will attempt a simplified version of, I'd like to try the standard course, Joe interrupted. After watching the others, the obstacles didn't seem particularly challenging. A murmur ran through the assembled students. Coach Vraxthul's eye cluster blinked rapidly. Fascinating, but perhaps unwise for your first attempt. Earth gravity is approximately 3 times Academy standard. Your muscle density and bone structure are... Please, Joe said. I'd rather not have special treatment. The coach seemed to consider this before rolling aside. Very well. Students, maintain safety. Distance. Human Joe Miller will attempt the standard course. Joe stepped up to the starting line, aware of the wary and curious eyes on him. He'd been an average athlete on Earth, but Lily had warned him about the gravity difference. He would need to be careful. He began with a light jog toward the first obstacle, the climbing wall. As his foot hit the ground, he was startled by how little resistance he felt. His light jog launched him forward at what felt like double speed. He nearly crashed into the wall, stopping himself just in time. The students gasped collectively. Joe looked up at the climbing wall. What had seemed a reasonable height from a distance now looked absurdly small. He reached for the first handhold and felt it crack slightly under his grip. Alarmed, he tried to be gentler as he began to climb. But climbing wasn't quite right. With the reduced gravity and his Earth-developed muscles, Joe found he could essentially pull himself up with minimal effort. What should have been a moderately challenging climb felt like ascending a ladder with extremely weak rungs. He reached the top in seconds, then faced the next problem, getting down without breaking anything. He tried to descend carefully, but halfway down a handhold snapped off in his grip. Joe found himself falling, but in the lower gravity it was more like floating down. He landed softly on his feet. More gasps from the audience. Next came the balance beam. Joe stepped onto it cautiously, but even his careful movements were exaggerated in the lower gravity. He felt absurdly unstable, like trying to walk on a tightrope while wearing springs. After 2 wobbling steps, he lost balance and fell, or, rather drifted, into the cushioned pit below. Nervous laughter rippled through the watching students. Joe climbed out, embarrassed. The reduced gravity made him stronger, but threw off his balance completely. Your center of mass adjustment is quite normal for new low-gravity exposure, Coach Vraxthul called encouragingly. Continue to the weighted obstacle. The next station featured a large spherical weight that needed to be pushed across a line about 5 meters away. Joe had watched Chinzar strain to move it earlier. He braced himself and pushed. The weighted ball shot across the floor as if it were made of foam, rocketing past the line and crashing into the far wall with a boom that echoed through the gymnasium. Complete. Silence fell. That was approximately 8 times the expected application of force, Coach Vraxthul said, his voice a mixture of shock and scientific excitement. Joe stood frozen in place, looking at the dent in the wall where the ball had hit. I'm sorry about that. I didn't realize. Fascinating. The coach rolled forward rapidly, producing a small device that he waved in Joe's direction. The potential kinetic output of human musculature in reduced gravity environments exceeds all projected models. The final obstacles were hurdles of increasing height. Joe approached them cautiously, trying to adjust for the gravity. He barely hopped over the first one and soared nearly 2 meters into the air, clearing not just the first hurdle but the next 3 as well. He landed awkwardly, stumbling forward into the final and tallest hurdle. The hurdle didn't stand a chance. It shattered on impact. Joe stood amid the broken pieces, horrified. I'm really sorry, I'll pay for the damage. But Coach Vraxthul was practically vibrating with excitement. Students, you have witnessed true Deathworld adaptation in action. The human's muscle fiber density and oxygenation capacity allow for force generation that would tear apart lower-class species bodies. Joe wanted to sink into the floor. This wasn't how he'd hoped to make a first impression. I believe this concludes our observational period, the coach continued. Human Joe Miller, for future sessions we will calibrate specialized equipment for your unique capabilities. As the class dispersed, many students gave Joe an even wider berth than before. A few, however, looked at him with newfound curiosity, rather than fear. Chinzar approached, his posture rigid. Impressive display of brute force human, but true athletic achievement requires control and technique, not just raw strength. Joe nodded. You're right. I have a lot to learn about moving in this gravity. Perhaps you would enjoy a more appropriate challenge, Chinzar suggested, his voice carrying to ensure others heard. A friendly competition next class. I will select an environment that tests more than simple strength. Joe recognized the trap but couldn't see a way to refuse without losing face. That sounds fair. Chinzar's mouth curved into what might have been a smile. Excellent, I look forward to it. He turned and walked away, his friends following close behind. As the gymnasium emptied, Joe examined the broken hurdle and dented wall with dismay. His first day, and he'd already destroyed school property and been challenged to what was essentially an alien duel. Told you it would be interesting, Lily said, appearing at his side. She'd apparently been watching from the observation area. Don't worry about the equipment. They build everything to be replaceable because of all the different species, and… Chinzar's challenge? Joe asked. Lily's expression turned serious. That's different. He never issues challenges he doesn't know he can win. Word of the Deathworlder challenge spread through the academy like wildfire. By morning, Joe could hardly walk down a corridor without hearing whispers or seeing students huddled around devices displaying odds for the upcoming contest. Some brave souls had even set up observation pools, with students betting academy credits on various outcomes ranging from human victory to structural damage to gymnasium. This is ridiculous, Joe complained to Lily as they sat in a quiet corner of the nutrition center. I've been here 2 days and I'm already the center of a sporting event. Lily shrugged. Better than being feared and avoided. At least now they're curious. She pushed a data tablet toward him. I did some research on Chinzar's homeworld. You should know what you're getting into. Joe scrolled through the information. Chinzar came from Viridian Prime, a Class 5 world, with 1.4 times Earth's gravity, dense jungle-like vegetation, and a slightly toxic atmosphere that required natives to develop specialized respiratory systems. He's choosing the competition environment, right? Joe asked, feeling a twist of anxiety. Absolutely. And trust me, it's going to be a simulation of his homeworld. Lily tapped the screen. The good news is the gravity will feel more familiar to you than Academy standard. The bad news is everything else. The atmosphere? Joe asked. You'll get a respirator, but it'll be uncomfortable. The local fauna is also aggressive, though the simulation won't include anything truly dangerous. Lily looked serious. But Chinzar grew up navigating these conditions. You'll be struggling just to move normally. Joe ran a hand through his hair. Why did I agree to this? Because refusing would have confirmed every stereotype about humans being just dumb brutes. Lily patted his arm. But don't worry. I've been helping you prepare a strategy. For the next 3 evenings, Joe and Lily used their free access time in the gym to practice in increased gravity settings. Joe was surprised to find that Zixtal had also begun offering assistance, providing detailed botanical information about Viridian Prime's plant life. Many species appear solid, but are actually hollow gas bladders, Zixtal explained, projecting images from his data device. Others have sharp filaments that can entangle limbs. Why are you helping me? Joe asked the Florbian, who still maintained a cautious distance but no longer trembled in his presence. Zixtal's fronds rustled softly. Scientific curiosity, he said. But there seemed to be more to it. After a pause, he added, and Chinzar once referred to photosynthetic species as furniture with opinions. I find I do not wish him to win. On the day of the challenge, Joe arrived at the gymnasium to find bleachers had been erected around the perimeter. At least 100 students and even some faculty members were present. A hush fell over the crowd as Joe entered. Coach Vrax Thul rolled forward to meet him. Human Joe Miller, today's environmental challenge has been approved by the safety committee. He handed Joe a small mask-like device. This will filter the atmospheric toxins in the simulation. The center of the gymnasium had transformed. Where there had been open space and training equipment, there was now what appeared to be a section of alien jungle. Dense purplish vegetation grew between gnarled tree-like structures. Twin artificial suns shone from the ceiling, casting odd, double shadows. Kinzar stood at the edge of the habitat, surrounded by his friends. He wore simple, close-fitting garments that Joe guessed would be practical for moving through dense vegetation. "The rules are simple," Coach Vraxthul announced. 3 marker flags have been placed throughout the habitat. Retrieve them and return to the starting point. First to collect all 3 wins. The boulder-like coach rotated to address the audience. The habitat contains simulated Viridian flora and minor fauna. Environmental conditions match Viridian prime standards. Joe fitted the respirator over his nose and mouth. It felt restrictive, and the air it provided had a metallic taste. Chinzar approached, looking completely at ease. "Ready to experience a real-world Deathworlder?" Joe nodded, not trusting himself to speak through the respirator without coughing. "Begin on the signal," Coach Vraxthul announced, backing away from the habitat edge. A tone sounded, and both competitors stepped into the alien environment. Joe immediately felt the increased gravity tugging at his limbs. While not as heavy as Earth, it was significantly more challenging than the Academy standard he'd started to adjust to. The air, even through the respirator, felt thick and humid. Chinzar moved with practiced ease, slipping between vegetation and quickly disappearing into the purple foliage. Joe tried to follow but found himself constantly entangled in clingy vines and caught by hidden thorns. The first flag was visible about 50 meters ahead, attached to a tall, spire-like plant. Joe pushed forward, trying to remember Zixtal's advice about which plants to avoid. He brushed against a bulbous growth which immediately burst, releasing a cloud of spores that made his eyes water. By the time Joe reached the first flag, he was already sweating heavily. As he grabbed it, he heard a rustling sound from above. Looking up, he saw Chinzar perched in the branches, already holding one flag. "Struggling with the atmosphere, human?" the scaled alien asked, sounding perfectly comfortable. Joe didn't waste energy responding. He tucked the flag into his pocket and moved toward where he thought the second marker might be. The habitat was larger than it appeared from outside, with winding paths through the thick vegetation. Joe found himself using his strength to push, directly through obstacles that Chinzar would likely navigate around. It wasn't elegant, but it was effective. The second flag was hidden beneath a cluster of broad-leafed plants beside a small pond of bubbling purple liquid. As Joe reached for it, the surface of the pond erupted. A creature resembling a cross between a frog and a starfish leaped toward him. Joe reacted instinctively, batting it away. The creature flew farther than he'd intended, crashing into the foliage with a pitiful croak. Simulation or not, Joe felt a pang of guilt. He grabbed the second flag and looked for a path to the third. The twin suns beat down, making the humidity nearly unbearable. Joe's Earth-adapted body was struggling with heat regulation in the strange environment. A crash through the underbrush caught his attention. One of Chinzar's friends, who had evidently entered the habitat to observe more closely, was backing away from what looked like a swarm of flying creatures. The student tripped and fell directly in the path of the approaching swarm. Without thinking, Joe changed direction, rushing toward the fallen alien. He reached the student just as the swarm descended, small, dart-like creatures with needle proboscises. Joe positioned himself between the swarm and the fallen alien, feeling multiple painful stings on his exposed skin. "Get out of the habitat," Joe shouted, helping the student to his feet and pushing him toward the edge of the simulation. The swarm continued their attack, but Joe's thicker skin provided better protection than the aliens would have. He swatted at the creatures, driving them back until the student reached safety. When Joe turned back to the challenge, he saw Chinzar watching him from a distance, the third flag already in his hand. Their eyes met across the habitat. Joe expected to see triumph, but instead saw something more complex: assessment, and perhaps a reluctant respect. "You stopped to help," Chinzar stated when they both exited the habitat a few minutes later. The scaled alien clutching all 3 flags. Joe removed his respirator, gulping fresh air. "Of course I did, even knowing it would cost you the victory." Chinzar's head tilted curiously. Deathworlders are supposed to prioritize winning at all costs. Joe wiped sweat from his forehead. Humans prioritize not letting people get hurt, if we can help it. The audience had gone silent watching the exchange. The student Joe had helped stepped forward. "The humans saved me from the sting fits," he announced, sounding confused. "They are only simulation, but painful nonetheless." Coach Vraxthul rolled forward. "Victory to Chinzar in the Flag Collection Challenge," he proclaimed. Then, after a pause, he added something unexpected. "And recognition to human Joe Miller for demonstration of Deathworlder protective instincts." The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheering for Chinzar's victory, others murmuring about Joe's actions. As the students dispersed, Joe noticed something had changed. While many still kept their distance, their expressions were different, curious rather than fearful, thoughtful rather than dismissive. Chinzar approached Joe one last time. "You would have had a better chance in an Earth simulation." "Probably," Joe agreed. "Perhaps next time," Chinzar said, before walking away with his friends who were looking at Joe with newly complicated expressions. Lily appeared at Joe's side, grinning. "You lost the competition but won something more important." "What's that?" "Their respect," she said. "And that's a lot harder to earn than any victory flag." 2 weeks after the challenge, the Academy announced its annual Cultural Exchange Festival. Each species would create a display sharing aspects of their homeworld and culture with the broader community. For most students, this was a cherished opportunity to educate others about their civilization and experience a taste of different worlds. For Joe and Lily, it presented a unique problem. "How do we showcase Earth without terrifying everyone?" Joe asked as they sat in the Academy's garden dome, a neutral space where various plant-based species often gathered. Zixtal was with them, having gradually become a regular companion. "Could focus on art and music," Lily suggested. "Those are universal. Or your adaptability," Zixtal offered, his fronds waving gently in the artificial breeze. Humans survived a death world by creating solutions to problems that would eliminate most species. Joe thought about this. In the weeks since the challenge, with Chinzar, attitudes toward him had shifted subtly. Students still maintained a cautious distance, but there was more curiosity than fear now. Several had even approached him with questions about Earth, though these often focused on its more extreme aspects. "What if we show them normal human life?" Joe said. "Not the storms and predators and disasters that make Earth a death world, but the everyday things. Show them we're not constantly fighting for survival." They spent the next few days gathering materials. The Academy allowed them to replicate simple Earth foods safe for most species to try. They created visual displays showing human communities, celebrations, and everyday activities. Joe even programmed a low-gravity version of simple human games that wouldn't require Deathworld strength to enjoy. On the day of the festival, they set up their booth in the Grand Hall, alongside displays from dozens of other worlds. Joe noticed Chinzar's elaborate exhibition nearby, showcasing the evolutionary adaptations that allowed his species to thrive in their challenging environment. At first, few students approached the Earth display. Most passed by with quick, nervous glances. Joe and Lily stood patiently, offering friendly smiles to anyone who looked their way. "This isn't working," Lily whispered after an hour of minimal interaction. "They're still too intimidated." Just then Zixtal appeared with several of his Florbian classmates. With deliberate showmanship, he approached the food samples and selected a piece of fruit. "I have consumed Earth vegetation before," he announced loudly enough for nearby students to hear. "It contains no toxins harmful to photosynthetic species." He ate the fruit with obvious enjoyment, his fronds rippling with pleasure. His companions, after hesitating briefly, followed his example. This small act broke the ice. Gradually, students from other species approached, first watching cautiously, then asking questions, and finally trying the samples themselves. "Is it true humans spend 1/3 of their lives unconscious?" asked a gelatinous student Joe recognized from the shower room. "We call it sleep, but yes," Joe explained. "Most humans need about 8 hours of rest each day." "Fascinating inefficiency," the student bubbled. "Yet you accomplished space travel despite this limitation." By midday, their booth had drawn a substantial crowd. Joe demonstrated simple Earth games modified for various physiologies, while Lily played recordings of human music, which many aliens found strangely compelling despite its chaotic patterns. Even Coach Vraxthul rolled by, examining their cultural display with his clustered eyes. Excellent presentation of Deathworld cultural adaptations. I am particularly interested in these sports activities. Joe was explaining the concept of swimming to a group of desert-evolved species when alarms suddenly blared throughout the hall. Red lights flashed as an automated voice announced, "Environmental system malfunction. Pressure anomaly detected. All students proceed to designated safety areas." Panic erupted immediately. Different species required different atmospheric conditions, and the Academy maintained these through complex environmental systems. A failure could be life-threatening for vulnerable species. Joe felt the change almost immediately, a subtle increase in pressure that made his ears pop. For him, it was merely uncomfortable, but he saw students around him reacting with varying degrees of distress. The gelatinous student was pulsating rapidly, while several avian species clutched at their breathing apparatuses. "Zixtal," Joe called, spotting his roommate whose fronds were beginning to curl inward. "What's happening?" "Pressure. Increasing," Zixtal managed, his voice strained. "Disrupts cellular processes for many species." The emergency doors were across the hall, but the crowd of panicking students had created a chaotic blockage. Joe saw several smaller species being pushed aside or trampled. Without hesitation, Joe lifted Zixtal gently and raised his voice. "Everyone stay calm. Smaller species first through the doors." His Deathworlder voice cut through the panic, commanding, "Attention." Surprisingly, Chinzar stepped forward from his booth, joining Joe. "Listen to the human," he called. "Form orderly lines by species vulnerability. Pressure-sensitive groups first." Together, they began organizing the evacuation, using their naturally intimidating presences to create order. Joe's human strength allowed him to lift fallen students and clear paths, while Chinzar's authority helped direct traffic. Lily had made her way to the environmental control panel near their booth. "The system's overcompensating for something," she called. "It's trying to equalize but overshooting." "Can you override it?" Joe asked, still holding Zixtal, who was looking increasingly wilted. "Not without authorization," she replied, frantically working the controls. Chinzar slithered over his scaled body, moving efficiently through the crowd. "My species has pressure tolerance," he said, examining the panel. "We need to manually vent the excess." "The maintenance tunnels," Joe suggested, remembering the Academy layout from his orientation materials. "They have manual overrides." "I know where they are," Chinzar said, "but they're narrow." Joe handed Zixtal to Lily. "Get him to safety. I'll go with Chinzar." The two former rivals pushed through the crowd toward a service door. The maintenance tunnel beyond was indeed narrow, designed for the small, multi-limbed maintenance drones rather than larger species. "I'll guide you," Chinzar said, slipping into the tunnel with serpentine ease. "Follow precisely." Joe had to crawl, his broader human frame barely fitting through some sections. The pressure continued to increase, making it difficult to think clearly. But his Deathworld physiology helped him push through discomfort that would have incapacitated others. They reached the manual override valve after several tense minutes. Chinzar attempted to turn it but couldn't generate enough torque in the confined space. "I need leverage," he hissed in frustration. Joe squeezed forward. "Let me." He gripped the valve and pushed, his human muscles straining against the resistance. For a moment nothing happened, then with a groan the valve began to turn. "More," Chinzar encouraged. "It needs 3 full rotations." Joe continued turning until they heard a loud hiss as pressure began venting from the system. Almost immediately, the alarms changed tone, indicating the emergency was being addressed. When they emerged back into the grand hall, they found most students had been safely evacuated. Maintenance crews were already working on the primary systems. "The pressure is stabilizing," an official announced. "Danger has passed. All students remain in safety areas until full system checks are complete." In the aftermath, Joe found himself surrounded by students from various species, many offering thanks or acknowledgments in their own cultural ways. Even those who had been most fearful of the Deathworlder now looked at him with new understanding. You used your strength to help, not harm, Zixtal said later when they were allowed to return to their quarters. The Florbian had recovered quickly once pressure normalized. This is not what most believe about Deathworlders. That's just being human, Joe replied. The next day, Academy Director Pelzan summoned Joe to the administrative offices. Joe arrived, expecting a reprimand for interfering with environmental systems, but instead found the director with Coach Vraxthul and several other faculty members. Human Joe Miller, the director began formally. Yesterday's events have prompted us to reevaluate our approach to Deathworld species integration. Your actions, alongside Chinzar's, demonstrated that physical capabilities we once considered threatening can be vital in emergency situations. Coach Vraxthul rolled forward enthusiastically. We are establishing a new comparative environments program, students from various planetary classifications working together to understand different evolutionary adaptations. We would like you to help develop this program, the director continued. Additionally, we have approved 3 more human exchange students for the next term. Joe left the meeting feeling a new sense of purpose. In the corridor outside, he found Chinzar waiting. It seems we will be working together, the scaled alien said. There was no longer any challenge in his tone, just a simple acknowledgement. As they walked together through the academy corridors, Joe noticed something had changed fundamentally. Students still moved aside. Chinzar and Joe were both physically imposing by academy standards, but the looks they received were no longer fearful. There was respect, curiosity, and something new. Acceptance. The Deathworlder had found his place among the stars.